What was in the cargo hold of the Mont-Blanc? 2,300 tons of picric acid, a high explosive compound used in artillery shells and landmines, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of benzol, a high-octane fuel derived from coal tar, stored in barrels on the ship's open deck, because the hold was already full of explosives, and 10 tons of gun cotton, a nitrocellulose propellant used in naval weapons. The total explosive mass aboard the SS Mont-Blanc, a French freighter built in 1899 and requisitioned by the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique for wartime service, was approximately 2,925 tons. The ship carried no flags, no markings, and no visible indication that it was a floating munitions depot. Wartime secrecy protocols prohibited the display of any signal that would identify a ship's cargo to enemy submarines. The harbor pilot who boarded the Mont-Blanc on the morning of December 6, 1917, to guide the ship through the narrows of Halifax Harbor, knew what was in the hold: the people standing on the waterfront, the people in the houses on the hillside above the harbor, the people in the schools and the factories and the railway yards and the sugar refinery along the shore, the people who would gather at their windows to watch the fire, did not. I found the records of what happened on the morning of December 6, 1917, in the harbor of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and what I found was the largest man-made explosion in the history of the world before the atomic bomb, caused not by a weapon, but by a supply ship, not by an attack, but by a navigational miscommunication in a crowded wartime harbor, and the explosion killed approximately 2,000 people, injured 9,000, left 25,000 homeless, obliterated every structure within a half-mile radius, generated a tsunami that reached 60 feet above the waterline, blinded hundreds of people who were watching the fire from their windows when the blast blew the glass into their eyes, and threw a 1,000-pound fragment of the Mont Blanc's anchor shaft more than 2 miles from the blast site. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project, later studied the Halifax explosion when computing the destructive radius of the atomic bombs he was building at Los Alamos. Halifax was the reference point. Halifax was the scale. For 28 years, from December 6, 1917 to August 6, 1945, the largest explosion that human beings had ever produced was an accident in a Canadian harbor on a Thursday morning in December. Halifax in December 1917 was a city at war. The harbor, one of the deepest and most ice-free ports on the Atlantic coast of North America, had been transformed by the war into one of the busiest military and commercial shipping hubs in the British Empire. Troop transports, supply ships, munitions carriers, hospital ships, neutral cargo vessels, and the armed escort destroyers that gathered them into convoys for the crossing to Europe crowded the harbor and the sheltered Bedford Basin beyond the Narrows. The Narrows, the channel that connected the outer harbor to Bedford Basin, was roughly 500 yards wide at its narrowest point, a bottleneck through which all traffic entering and leaving the inner harbor had to pass. Anti-submarine nets were raised across the harbor entrance every evening at sunset and lowered every morning at sunrise to control access and prevent German U-boats from entering the port. The volume of wartime traffic through this bottleneck was enormous, and the regulations governing the traffic were enforced by a harbor command structure that was, by the assessment of the subsequent inquiry, inadequate to the volume and the danger of the shipping it was managing. The SS Imo, a Norwegian vessel under charter to the Commission for Relief in Belgium, had arrived in Halifax on December 3rd and spent 2 days in Bedford Basin awaiting refueling. The Imo was empty, bound for New York to take on relief supplies. Her departure on December 5th was delayed because her coal load did not arrive until late afternoon, and the fueling was not completed before the anti-submarine nets were raised for the night. The Imo could not leave the harbor until the nets were lowered the next morning. The SS Mont-Blanc arrived from New York late on the evening of December 5th, loaded with the explosives she had taken on at the Gravesend Bay Munitions Depot in New York Harbor. The Mont-Blanc was bound for Bordeaux, France, to deliver the munitions to the Western Front. She intended to join a slow convoy assembling in Bedford Basin, but she arrived after the submarine nets had been raised, and so she anchored outside the harbor for the night, waiting for the nets to open in the morning. On the morning of December 6, 1917, the nets were lowered. The Mont-Blanc entered the harbor from the outer approaches, heading north through the Narrows toward Bedford Basin. At the same time, the Imo left Bedford Basin, heading south through the Narrows toward the open sea. The two ships were converging in the narrowest section of the channel. What followed was a series of navigational signals and course adjustments that have been reconstructed in detail by the subsequent inquiry and by historians, and that amount to a catastrophic miscommunication. The Imo was on the wrong side of the channel, traveling on the port side of the Narrows rather than the starboard side as regulations required, at a speed of 7 knots, which was above the harbor speed limit of 5 knots. The Imo had been forced to the port side by other traffic, including a tug called the Stella Maris that had moved to avoid the Imo's path. The Mont-Blanc's pilot gave a single blast on the ship's whistle, indicating that the Mont-Blanc had the right of way and was holding her course. The Imo answered with 2 blasts, indicating that she was not willing or not able to yield. The Mont-Blanc whistled again. The Imo whistled again. Both ships had cut their engines, but the forward momentum of both vessels could not be overcome. In a last-moment maneuver, the Mont-Blanc turned to port, attempting to pass the Imo on the opposite side. The Imo's bow struck the Mont-Blanc's starboard side, penetrating the hold near the forward hatch. The collision was low speed. The impact itself caused minimal structural damage, but the Imo's bow, striking the steel hull of the Mont-Blanc, produced sparks. The sparks ignited the barrels of benzol that were stored on the Mont-Blanc's open deck. Benzol is extremely flammable. The fire spread across the deck within seconds, feeding on the fuel that was sitting in the open air in wooden barrels. The flames reached the ventilators and the hatch covers. Black smoke billowed from the ship. The crew of the Mont-Blanc, 41 men under the command of Captain Aimé Lemedec, knew exactly what was in the hold beneath the fire. They knew that if the fire reached the picric acid and the TNT, the ship would explode with a force that no one on board or near the ship could survive. Captain Lemedec ordered the crew to abandon ship. The men launched lifeboats, rowed toward the Dartmouth shore on the eastern side of the harbor, and tried to warn people on the shore that the burning ship was loaded with munitions. The warnings were not understood. The crew spoke French. The dock hands spoke English. The message did not cross the language barrier in time. The Mont-Blanc, unmanned and burning, drifted with the current and the tide toward the Halifax shore, toward Pier 6 in the Richmond district of the city's north end. The fire was spectacular. Black smoke and orange flame rose from the deck of the drifting ship in columns that were visible for miles across the harbor and from the hills above the city. Sailors on other vessels in the harbor gathered on their decks to watch. The crew of the tugboat Stella Maris, which had earlier moved to avoid the Imo's path, saw the fire and moved toward the Mont-Blanc to attempt to tow it away from the pier and into the open harbor. The Stella Maris got a line on the Mont-Blanc and tried to pull, but the fire was too intense and the tow line had to be abandoned. The Halifax Fire Department responded. The fire engine Patricia, crewed by 8 men under Deputy Chief Billy Wells, raced to the waterfront to fight the fire. The Patricia's crew connected their hoses and were preparing to direct water onto the burning ship when the explosion occurred. 7 of the 8 men on the Patricia were killed instantly. Deputy Chief Wells, the sole survivor, was thrown through the air by the blast wave and buried in wreckage. He was pulled from the debris hours later, badly injured, and he later described the scene in the streets around the blast center. He found bodies, some with their heads missing and some thrown onto the overhead telegraph wires. People along the waterfront came to the shore to see the burning ship. They stood on the docks, on the wharves, on the railway platforms. Children on their way to school stopped to look. Factory workers at the Acadia Sugar Refinery and the Nova Scotia Cotton Mill paused at their stations near the windows. Office workers in the buildings along Barrington Street looked out. Residents at the houses on the hillside above the harbor, the wooden houses of the Richmond neighborhood where the dock workers and the railwaymen and the factory hands lived with their families, walked to their front windows and their kitchen windows and pressed their faces to the glass. Some of them lifted their children to the windows to see the ship burning on the harbor. The fire had been burning for approximately 20 minutes. It was 9:04 in the morning. The children were being held up to the glass. The glass was about to come inward. If this story interests you, the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax maintains the most comprehensive collection of artifacts and records from the explosion, including Vince Coleman's telegraph key, his watch, his wallet, and the blood-stained blue dress of his 2-year-old daughter. The Halifax Explosion, a remembrance book at the Nova Scotia Archives, identifies 1,782 confirmed victims by name. The records are there. Subscribe if you want to see where the next thread leads. At approximately 750 feet from Pier 6, in the Richmond Railway Yards, a 45-year-old railway dispatcher named Patrick Vincent Coleman was at his telegraph key in the small wooden station house. Coleman and his colleague, Chief Clerk William Lovett, had heard the collision and seen the smoke rising above the freight cars in the yard. A crew member from the Mont-Blanc, running from the waterfront, reached the railway yards and communicated, through broken English or through gestures, that the burning ship was loaded with munitions and was going to explode. Lovett turned and ran. Coleman started to run with him. Then Coleman stopped. He turned around. He went back to the telegraph key. An incoming passenger train, the number 10 from St. John, New Brunswick, carrying roughly 300 passengers, was due to arrive at the Richmond station within minutes. The train was heading directly toward the blast zone. Coleman sat down at the key and began tapping out a message in Morse code. The message was received by every station on the railway telegraph line from Halifax to Truro, 60 miles to the north. The accepted version of the message reads, "Hold up the train. Munitions ship on fire and making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." The passenger train was stopped at Rockingham Station, 6.4 kilometers from the city center on the western shore of Bedford Basin. 300 passengers survived because a man who knew he was about to die went back to his desk and sent a message instead of running. Coleman was 45 years old. He left behind his wife Frances and 4 children, including his 2-year-old daughter Eileen, who was at home on Russell Street in the Richmond neighborhood, 2,000 feet from the blast center, wearing a blue dress that her mother had sewn by hand. The kitchen sink of the Coleman house crashed down on Eileen during the explosion, cutting her neck badly. The bloodstains on the blue dress are still visible today. Frances and Eileen survived. Vincent Coleman did not. His body was found days later in the wreckage of the Richmond Railway Yards. His watch was recovered, the crystal and the hands had been blown away. The back of the case was pounded in, as the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic describes it, as if by hammers. Water stains from the tsunami are still visible on his wallet. His telegraph key, his watch, his wallet, his pen, and Eileen's blue dress are on permanent display at the Maritime Museum in Halifax. At 9:04 and 35 seconds a.m. on December 6, 1917, the fire on the Mont-Blanc reached the cargo hold. The explosion released the equivalent energy of approximately 2.9 kilotons of TNT, 1/5 the force of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima 28 years later. The fireball rose more than 2 miles into the sky. Captain W.M.A. Campbell of the inbound Canadian merchant ship Acadian measured the peak of the cloud at 3,600 meters, using a sextant from approximately 28 kilometers away. The blast wave traveled outward from the center of the detonation at supersonic speed, snapping trees, bending iron rails, demolishing buildings, and grounding vessels in the harbor. The Mont Blanc was vaporized. The ship ceased to exist. Fragments of her hull, her machinery, her deck fittings, and her anchor rained down across a radius of several kilometers. The anchor shaft, weighing more than 1,000 pounds, was thrown more than 2 miles from the blast site and was later recovered as a memorial artifact. A fragment of one of her deck cannons was found 5.6 kilometers away. The Richmond district of Halifax's north end was obliterated. Every structure within an 800-meter radius of the blast center was destroyed. The Acadia Sugar Refinery, a large brick and stone factory near Pier 6, disappeared into an unrecognizable heap of rubble, killing most of its workers. The Nova Scotia cotton mill, 1.5 kilometers from the blast, was destroyed by fire and the collapse of its concrete floors. The Richmond Railway Yards and station were destroyed, killing 55 railway workers and destroying or damaging more than 500 railway cars. Large residential neighborhoods in the hillside above the harbor, streets of wooden houses occupied by the families of dock workers, railwaymen, factory workers, and sailors, were swept flat. The blast wave hit the houses, and the houses disintegrated. The debris of the houses became projectiles. The people inside the houses were struck by the walls and the roofs and the floors of their own homes. One fireman from the engine, Patricia, who had been responding to the fire on the Mont-Blanc before the explosion, later described the scene. He found people in the streets and in the wreckage, some with their heads missing, and some thrown onto the overhead telegraph wires. He was the only member of the 8-man crew of the Patricia to survive. The blast vaporized the water in the narrows of the harbor. For a brief moment, the floor of the harbor was visible. Then the sea rushed in to fill the void, and the displaced water formed a tsunami that rose to 18 meters, 60 feet, above the high water mark on the Halifax side of the harbor. The tsunami swept over the waterfront, drowning survivors who had been blown into the harbor by the blast and carrying wreckage inland. On the Dartmouth shore, across the harbor from Halifax, the tsunami wiped out a community of Mi'kmaq people who had lived in the Tufts Cove area for generations. The Imo, the Norwegian ship that had collided with the Mont-Blanc, was carried by the tsunami onto the shore at Dartmouth, grounded and badly damaged. The people who had been watching the fire from their windows were struck by a specific and terrible category of injury. Hundreds of Halifax residents had been standing at their windows, faces pressed to the glass, watching the spectacular fire on the harbor when the blast wave arrived. The wave shattered the glass in front of their faces and drove the fragments into their eyes. In the weeks that followed, Halifax's doctors and the medical teams that arrived from across Canada and the United States treated an extraordinary wave of eye trauma and blindness that was unlike anything the medical profession had previously encountered in peacetime. Approximately 200 people were permanently blinded by flying glass. The blindness was so concentrated and so distinctive in its cause, hundreds of people blinded at the same instant by the same mechanism, that it spurred new Canadian efforts in the care and rehabilitation of the blind in the years after the war. The people who went blind at 9:04 on the morning of December 6th had been doing nothing wrong. They had been looking out their windows. They had been curious about a fire. They had not known that the ship was carrying 2,925 tons of explosives because the wartime secrecy protocols that were supposed to protect the cargo from German submarines had also protected it from the people who lived within the blast radius. The numbers that followed the explosion are almost too large to hold in the mind, while also remembering that each number is a person. Approximately 1,600 people died instantly in the blast, the debris, the fires, and the collapse of buildings. An additional 300 or more died in the hours and days that followed from injuries sustained in the explosion. The official death toll, compiled by the Halifax Explosion Remembrance Book at the Nova Scotia Archives, identifies 1,782 confirmed victims by name, though many estimates place the total at 2,000 or higher, because approximately 250 bodies were never identified, and many victims were never found. 9,000 people were injured. More than 1,630 homes were destroyed outright. Over 12,000 buildings were damaged. 25,000 people were left without adequate shelter in a Canadian December, in a city where the temperature was dropping and the wind was blowing off the North Atlantic, and the wreckage of their homes was scattered across the hillside where their neighborhood had stood that morning. Less than 24 hours after the explosion, the weather turned. A major blizzard swept into Halifax from the west, burying the ruins under 16 inches of snow, dropping the temperature below freezing, knocking down the telegraph lines that had been hastily repaired after the blast, and isolating the city from the outside world at the moment it most needed help. Survivors who had been trapped in the wreckage of their homes since the morning of the explosion were now buried under snow as well as debris. Rescue workers who had been digging through collapsed buildings with their bare hands were now fighting hypothermia in addition to exhaustion. The blizzard, arriving on top of the explosion, created a compound disaster that tested the limits of every relief organization and every individual in the city. The help came. It came first from the military installations around the harbor, where soldiers and sailors who had survived the blast organized rescue parties within minutes and began pulling survivors from the wreckage. It came from across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick by rail, as a dozen relief trains loaded with firefighters, doctors, nurses, and medical supplies were dispatched from towns along the railway line on the day of the explosion itself, traveling through the damage zone and past the wreckage of the Richmond railway yards to reach the city center. It came from central Canada, where military and civilian authorities mobilized construction equipment and emergency housing materials, and it came from Boston. When news of the explosion reached Boston, carried by the railway telegraph that Vincent Coleman's message had first activated, the city mobilized with a speed and a generosity that Halifax never forgot. A relief train loaded with doctors, nurses, surgeons, medical supplies, blankets, clothing, food, and construction materials was dispatched from Boston within hours of the news arriving. The train traveled north through New England, crossed into New Brunswick, and pushed through the blizzard that was burying Halifax, through snowdrifts that stalled other relief trains for days, arriving in Halifax while the city was still burning and the snow was still falling and the rescue workers were still digging through wreckage with their bare hands in below freezing temperatures. The Massachusetts relief effort did not end with the first train. The state sent an ongoing commitment of medical personnel, reconstruction specialists, supplies, and financial assistance that continued for months after the explosion. Governor Samuel McCall of Massachusetts personally oversaw the relief coordination. Halifax's hospitals, overwhelmed by 9,000 injured, many of them blinded, received surgical teams from Boston and New York that performed operations around the clock in facilities that had themselves been damaged by the blast. The people of Nova Scotia did not forget. Since 1971, the province of Nova Scotia has sent a Christmas tree to the city of Boston every year, a large tree selected by the province and shipped to Boston and erected and lit in a public ceremony as a token of gratitude for the relief that Boston provided in December 1917. The tree arrives every year, the gratitude arrives with it. The reason for the gratitude is a French munition ship, a navigational miscommunication in a 500-yard wide channel, a fire that lasted 20 minutes, and 2,925 tons of explosives that the people watching from their windows did not know were there. I started with a question about a cargo hold, 2,300 tons of picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of benzol on the open deck, 10 tons of gun cotton, the total, approximately 2,925 tons, made the Mont-Blanc one of the most lethally loaded vessels ever to enter Halifax Harbor, and the wartime secrecy protocols that were designed to protect the cargo from the enemy also protected it from the harbor, from the city, from the people who gathered at their windows to watch the fire. The pilot who boarded the ship that morning knew what was in the hold. The crew who abandoned the ship and rowed for the Dartmouth shore knew what was in the hold. Vincent Coleman, the railway dispatcher who went back to his telegraph key and sent the message that saved 300 lives and signed off with "Goodbye, boys," knew what was in the hold, or at least knew enough. The 2,000 people who died did not know. The 200 who were blinded did not know. The Mi'kmaq community at Tufts Cove that the tsunami erased did not know. They were living in a city at war, in a harbor full of wartime shipping, surrounded by cargo they could not see and danger they had not been told about. The information that could have saved them was classified. Coleman's watch is in a glass case at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. The crystal is gone. The hands are gone. The back is caved in. The watch stopped at 9:04. His telegraph key sits beside it. His wallet, with the water stains from the tsunami, sits beside that, and his daughter Eileen's blue dress, the dress that Francis Coleman sewed by hand, the dress that was stained with the blood from the kitchen sink that fell on a 2-year-old girl 2,000 feet from the largest man-made explosion before the atomic bomb. It's in the same case. The dress is small, the stains are dark, the case is open to the public. Nobody has to take my word for any of it. The evidence is in the museum. There are more of these stories, more machines, more furnaces, More men who went into the dark and came out different or didn't come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how a false fire alarm at a miner's Christmas party killed 73 people, 59 of them children, in a staircase 5 feet 9 inches wide, that video is on screen now.